Well, thank you, Lynn. I hope I can live up to that. I wish she were kidding, but she's not about the 3 hours of sleep, so I may be looking at my notes a little more than I normally would. So at Williams, we had our board meeting in Houston earlier this week, and so we flew back late last night, and I'm working on 3 hours of sleep, but I'll get more sleep tonight, so it's going to be okay. So as Lynn said, a little bit about my background. So I grew up in Arkansas on a farm in the middle of the state in between Conway and Little Rock. I realized as a child my parents worked really hard and still could barely make ends meet, and so I thought I want to go to college. So I went to school at the University of Arkansas, got 2 degrees from there, one in psychology, one in business, and then I got recruited to Tulsa, so I've been in Tulsa ever since, so about 2000. So Tulsa almost seems like home to me because I've been there as long as I was in Arkansas, almost. And so I love Williams, love the Tulsa community. It's been really good for me. For those of you who may not be not be familiar with Williams, as Lynn said, we have about 5,000 employees. We are a natural gas pipeline company, so we have about 30,000 miles of pipeline across the United States, and we actually handle about 30% of the U.S.'s natural gas. So wanted to give you a little fun fact about that. So let's get the clicker going here. All right, I'm sure everyone in this room can agree, and as you know, Peter shared with the guiding principle this morning, ethical and moral considerations are in front and center in our world today, and they need to be in front and center of also making our business decisions and our operations. And we continue to see challenges in judgment, whether that be in the business world, whether that be sports, media, podcast, you name it, seems to be everywhere we are right now. And so although it seems like a high bar to reach to be ethical and have these high standards, and make no mistake, it can be at times, it can be achievable, and with that comes right back to what Lynn talked about, people. So the people at Williams are great people. They want to do the right thing, and that's what you want to embed to have an ethical culture, is the people have the right people. So wanted to give a shout out to them because they certainly are great to work with. So to be ethical, it's all about building the muscle that it takes to have situational thinking. I can't give you a playbook that says, here's what to do in XYZ situation, because every situation is going to be different. So we can't give you a playbook. So what we do try to do is teach you how to make decisions and recognize red flags, so that way you can build that muscle memory to recognize those when you see them. And I think it also comes from having a great ethical culture embedded in your daily activities. So you can have a very fancy poster on a wall. You can have all the documents in a policies and procedure book or your code of conduct. But if that's literally just in a book on a bookshelf or a poster on a wall that you're not living out day to day, then you're not really getting what we look for at Williams as having an ethical culture. So ethical leaders set the example for the rest of the company. And they have to do that by their daily words and actions, not just talking it, but walking the talk. And so I want to give an example, and I'm going to share a lot of examples today. I personally learned by examples, and I think they're just more interesting than bullet points. But I wanted to share an example of an ethical leader that I felt did that absolutely stood tried and true to who he was, even though it was more painful for him in the moment. So as Lynn said, I spent 13 years at Koch Industries. That's David and Charles Koch, the Koch brothers, not Coca-Cola. And I had the pleasure to work directly for David Koch. And he had an office in New York City, so he did not live in Wichita, Kansas, where their headquarters are. His brother lived there, Charles, but David lived in New York and officed out of one of the Koch companies called Koch Supply and Trading, so they have a lot of traders there. And I would have to go up to the New York office often to support him, get him ready for business reviews, those sorts of things. And over time, I got to know the traders there, even though I didn't support them. They were supported by a Houston HR leader. They would come to me and talk to me about issues that they were having with David's office manager. Now, to give you a little background, David's office manager had worked for him for over a decade, and certainly knew lots of things about his personal life, lots of things about work, how he liked things, which he was a little unique. He liked things a certain way. And so when he said, I need an appointment with this person, she knew exactly who that meant. She didn't have to ask him who it was, if he needed a doctor's appointment, whatever those were, right? She was able to handle that. And the traders came to me and said, Debbie, we're really having a problem with her. She's not being very respectful to us. She's treating us poorly. I then talked to her. There were several executive assistants that also worked in the office, and they said the same thing. So I talked to her about it, tried to give her feedback, tried to help, and honestly, I think that made it worse. And so as I continued to make trips to New York City, I kept hearing really bad feedback on her. And so finally it came to the point where I sat down with David and I said, David, listen, I'm going to tell you some news that you are not going to want to hear today. And he said, well, just tell it to me. So I said, I think it's time that we separate your office manager. And I told him why. And I said, I know this is a hard decision because it's going to be very painful for you if you approve this recommendation that I'm bringing to you. But it's very toxic. It's not getting better. I've tried. I don't think she wants it to get better. And at this point, there's so much resentment in the office. I think we just need to move on and part ways. And I thought, I was just like bracing myself. Here it comes. He's going to say, no way, I can't do that. And he said, Debbie, we have a respectful workplace policy here, and that's all the way from the top to the bottom. And if she's doing that, then that's a bad reflection on me. That's a bad reflection on this company. And I believe you, I trust our traders, I trust the other executive assistants here, so let's terminate her. And I said, okay, well, let me think about this, the timing. I know you might have to have a runway in front of you. You probably don't want to do that immediately. We need to start to backfill the role. And he goes, nope, you're in town, let's just do it today. And we did. And I think that sets the tone from the top of we actually act out and do what we say we're going to do. Even though she didn't break a law, she didn't break a policy necessarily, she just wasn't acting and modeling the behavior that we wanted to have. And so he, to me, from that moment on, I knew I could go to him with anything. He wasn't going to get mad if I had to tell him some really bad news. And again, this was hard for him. This was a painful process. We had to open up a new role, and this person had to completely train a whole new person. That was painful for him, but he personally made the decision that it was the right thing to do for the other employees in the New York City office and for the company. So just wanted to call that out. In addition to leaders like that, there's also other reasons other than it just being the right thing to do why we want to have an ethical culture. So it helps us to have a healthier workplace environment. So who wants to dread to come to work every day because you don't know what you're going to walk into or you don't know what kind of leadership you have? It increases the sense of belonging. If you know that you can be yourself, that you can trust others, that you know that they assume positive intent and they are going to assume the same back of you, that creates loyalty as well. So people want to stay in a culture where they feel like there's that trust there. I really like this quote from Potter Stewart, who was the former Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. I think it's spot on, and it's at the bottom of the screen. Ethics is knowing the difference between what you have a right to do and what is the right thing to do. So with that, I want to move on and let's dig into specific traits of an ethical leader. So we need more leaders who are committed to be courageous, and that I didn't know that you guys were going to talk about courage today, but who are courageous and who have wholehearted leadership and who are self-aware enough to lead through these three traits. I truly believe that ethical culture starts from tone at the top, as I mentioned before, and is created and sustained when clear expectations are met and it's obvious what's tolerated and what's not going to be tolerated. This can have a huge impact on the organization. I'll spend some time discussing each of these components and give you some descriptions as well. As I mentioned, I give you some examples of how some things played out in my career. The goal is not what behavior we display and then move on. It's a continuous cycle where it requires intentionality with an overall goal of weaving these mindsets into the fabric of your culture. And you have to have that all the way throughout your organization. So first, let's start with accountability. Oh, I didn't realize there was animations there, sorry. All right, you've heard accountability, but can you define it? This term is often a buzzword, but often misunderstood. Employees can often view it as a negative, associating it with blame or punishment for lackluster performance. It can be easily missed to understand the difference between accountability versus responsibility. Accountability is actually positive. It's a proactive choice to take personal ownership of existing problems and potential solutions. True accountability, according to the New York Times best-selling book of the Oz Principle, is the personal choice to rise above one's circumstances and demonstrate the ownership necessary for achieving those desired results. Accountability can transform your workplace, promoting success both at an individual and organizational level. So let's look at how leaders demonstrate that. First, they have to know their internal compass. You have to know who you are and know who you're going to stand, how you're going to make a stand on things, because if not, when you go into those conversations and you go into those negotiations, you don't have a clue of where your true north is. So you have to know who you are and where you stand on things. I also want to encourage you to trust your gut. Don't ever try to convince yourself to believe something that you know you don't believe, that isn't part of your North Star. And I'll give an example here of something that I trusted my gut, and it was uncomfortable and unpopular, but we found out at the end, I think it was the right thing to do. So we were getting quite a bit of pressure from our investors. So we're a publicly traded company, so a lot of investors call us, and they were asking us about our diversity and inclusion metrics. So what percent of underrepresented populations do you have in each of your job groups? And so I would spend a lot of time on investors' calls going through metrics versus talking about the actual programs that we have in place, such as our recruiting process and things of that matter. So we had developed an internal D&I metrics report that we had published. And so the D&I Council and I had a meeting, and we said, we really think it would solve a lot of these investor questions if we just went ahead and published that externally. The problem with that is, if we're being transparent and honest, some of those numbers weren't as good as what we would hope them to be. But we really felt at the end of the day, it's better to be transparent and we're telling them anyway, verbally I'm telling them anyway, let's just go ahead and post it so we can start the conversation and say, we're not where we need to be, we appreciate that, but these are the programs we have in place that we're trying to organically change that. So here, I want to be clear, we are not an organization that supports quotas. We want to organically expand the recruiting talent pool to organically hire the most qualified people. So there was a lot of pushback in the organization from that, just from fear. Are we going to get attacked by the investors? What about other people when we're trying to attract a talent into the organization? Is that going to be viewed as a negative versus a positive that we publish this data? I really stuck to my gut in that decision. There was a lot of friction in that meeting. There was a lot of people that felt strongly that maybe we really shouldn't do this. Like, is this the right way? Are we going too far? And I said, but I feel like we're spending all the time on that very thing that we don't want to spend a lot of time on. Let's talk about how we're fixing the problem, not just the problem we have. So I think it would be better just to share the data, and then we can have a conversation about other stuff. So that's where we ended up getting. We got approval that day to do that, and I will say that has been very good for us, and that worked out the way we had hoped, is that now that data is available, investors and others are looking at that data before they call us, and so we can have a conversation. Let's talk about all the things we did this year, and let's look ahead at what our roadmap looks for 2023 and beyond. And so sometimes you have to stick to your gut, you have to trust where you stand on things and stick with it, even though it's uncomfortable in the middle of the conversation. Accountable, ethical leaders also admit mistakes and share a recovery plan when needed. As Lynn said, I'm very transparent, and I tell my team all the time, I do not have the best ideas. I am going to be wrong, and I do use the thing that Peter said, I ask for grace. But it works two ways. I will give you grace, but I also ask that you give me grace, because I'm going to mess up and I'm going to get something wrong, because we're human. We all are. And that's okay. I said, I just want you to assume positive intent with me, and I'll do the same for you. We've got to come together and give grace to each other versus pulling each other apart. So we actually, this last year at Williams, we implemented a new competency called values differences. Why did we do that? Because we want to value our differences, and even though we may be at polar opposite ends of the spectrum on a topic, a social topic, I expect us to work well together anyway. I expect us to work well together anyway and still get our job done anyway. So we added that competency for that reason. So someone who's willing to be wrong and know that they've made a mistake and move on. And then lastly, ethical leaders are willing to assume full responsibility. Ethical leaders hold themselves accountable, take charge, and shape the present and future through their words and deeds. And lack of this, organizations that lack that, it leads to ineffectiveness, confusion, inaction, and waste of time and resources, and I've certainly seen that. And when I talk about accountability, something that I grew up on a farm in Arkansas, so you'll appreciate that when I tell you this story, something that my parents taught me at a very young age, and it was my mom and dad always saying, Debbie, no one ever likes to be wrong, and no one ever wants to what they call eat crow. But my dad would always say, but it's sure better to eat it when it's warm than when it's cold. So the point of that is, don't let it sit. If you make a mistake, own it and go eat the warm crow. It's not going to taste good, but it's going to taste better than cold crow. So just a little Arkansas joke for you there. I also wanted to share a story about fear of failure, because oftentimes people don't want to hold others accountable because they're fearful. So I'll share this story about Charles Koch. So I did not work with him as closely as I did with David, but we had gone to the board to present an acquisition that we wanted to purchase. And so we were going through the deal and going through the economics. And again, one thing I loved about them was they asked me about the culture. Well, who's going to be the leader, Debbie? And do you think they're going to fit in good with us? And do we need to, infiltrate other leaders there to make sure that they're going to do things the right way? And so we're going through this presentation. And at the end of the presentation, my boss was a little unsure of this deal. This was a little outside of our norm. And he said, gosh, Charles, what do you think? Do you think we should do this or not do this? What do you have concerns about? And I'll never forget what Charles said. He said, I don't know. I've heard about this for 20 minutes. I have no idea if this is a good deal or not a good deal, but I'll tell you this, I trust you, and if you want to do the deal, go do the deal. And if it fails, try not to fail next time. Learn from it. Learn from your failures. And he said, if I look at your acquisitions that you've done over the last 10 years, and he kind of called us out, slide 2 of the deck, you talk about how the last 10 deals have been really, really good. He goes, I would challenge you that I don't like that scorecard. He said, if the last 10 acquisitions that you guys have done have been that well, then you probably haven't taken on enough risk, and you're not learning anything, because you'll learn a lot more from your failures than you do your successes. So we ended up doing the deal. But for him to have the humility to say, I don't know if this is the right thing to do or not. And then for him to also say, it's okay to fail. I'm giving you permission to fail, and you're still going to be around despite that. So again, just a really pivotal moment for me of what type of leader that I knew that I wanted to work for. So next, let's move to transparency, another key value that I certainly appreciate. And I think that an organization's culture, regardless of your industry, comes back to people. And so your people define your culture, and a healthy culture thrives on trust. So I'd like to challenge you to reflect on your own experience building trust. For me, trust is a really big deal. When people gain our trust or break it, it matters, and I think trust is a big word and it packs a ton of weight. Trust is earned in the smallest of moments, and that's where I think people get confused. They think it's this big heroic thing or a big thing. It's actually not. It's little things over and over time. So paying attention, listening, and having genuine care and concern about people help build that trust. And I believe that trust is evident when we deliver on our commitments. Another saying that my parents always taught me as a kid is don't overcommit and underdeliver. So that's something that is ingrained into my head that my parents would tell me all the time. So let's look at some ways that ethical leaders can display transparency. First, they raise their concerns even when unpopular. So ethical leaders know that overlooking important details may cause significant changes. And so they carefully observe situations and they identify potential issues. And when facing doubt or dilemma, they go ahead and raise their concern, even if this means slowing things down, slowing the process down, or generating more work. And I love Brene Brown, and I want to give her a quote that she says in her book, Daring to Lead. Clear is kind, unclear is unkind. In this statement, she speaks to the fact that most of us avoid clarity because we tell ourselves that we're being kind, when what we're really doing is actually being unkind and unfair. And so I think that this includes the importance of challenging questions when we need to ask questions. Sometimes people don't want to poke the bear. They don't want to ask the hard question when sometimes it's like the elephant in the room, the question that needs to be asked. And so it's having the courage to do that. And effective leaders meet tough situations head on versus than avoid them. They go to them head on and start asking questions and trying to solve the problem. Also, leaders walk the talk, and I mentioned that earlier. Ethical leaders have to act with integrity, and they have to practice what they preach. And again, I think that really comes from the tone at the top. And as I mentioned earlier, never underestimate the fact that as a leader, you're always on stage. People are always looking at you. What are you going to say? How are you going to handle it? What's your body language? And so we live in a fishbowl as leaders, and people are looking to us to set that tone. So ethical leaders also act with fairness. And leaders must face many decisions and negotiations, and those leaders clearly have favors that they favor long-term wins over short-term gains, right? So they're looking at the long term. And it's critical to set clear expectations on what it is and isn't tolerated, as I mentioned. And I want to note that the importance of the role of fairness when creating an inclusive environment. So perceptions of workplace fairness and respect are closely associated with the perceptions of belonging, and belonging is necessary, in my opinion, for bringing out the best of everybody's work. Again, if people come to work and they're fearful and they feel like they can't be themselves, they feel like they can't ask the question that they don't know the answer to, then you're not going to get the best results. So as I mentioned, we've had a lot of space in our core values and diversity and inclusion at Williams, and one of the things we also did over the past few years was we introduced a new value called authentic. And we want employees to be able to be their authentic self, ask the uncomfortable question, it's okay if you don't know the answer, and have that belonging piece, because we feel like that, again, creates people to stay, retention in the company. Mother Teresa said, honesty and transparency make you vulnerable. Be honest and transparent anyway. I think that transparency builds trust and that people feel safe and empowered and, again, do their best work. So I want to share an example of when a leader did not do that well one time. So this was many, many years ago. We had an acquisition at Coke, and this particular acquisition had an office in South Korea. So we were in Seoul, and we had to do code of conduct training and ethical training and respectful workforce training, because they had not been owned by a U.S. company before. So there's something called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act that all of you attorneys know in the room, that they were not bound by, that they would be bound by on day one when owned by a U.S. company. So we're in a hotel ballroom, and there's over 100 people there, and we're going through our presentations and talking about the new norms and what's expected of them. And the president of that company stood up and was asking some really egregious questions and really challenging our philosophy on this. Well, why do we have to do this? This is why we're so profitable here. What I learned that day is that in South Korea, they often would take customers to a karaoke, which is not the same, by the way, as it is in the US, that I learned, but right before they had big deals made with customers. And that's just not allowed. That's against the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, but also even broader than that, Coke did not want to gain business with our customers because of that. We wanted to gain our businesses from our customers because we were the best. We were the best operator. We were the best manufacturer. We were a good ethical company, not because they took them out for a big fancy dinner the night before they bid on a project. And so we realized quickly that this leader wasn't getting it and that we had to make a change. And so we flew back home. We got our act together. We figured out what our plan was. We flew back to Seoul, Korea. Days later, we terminated that leader, and then we held another town hall. And the reason we did that is we wanted to be transparent. We felt that that was very important to say, look, this isn't working, and that's okay. We invite him to go be successful somewhere else, but if you're going to be here at our company, this is what the expectations are. And you're not going to make it if that's what you want to do, and that's fine. If you want to leave, you can. There's no locks on the doors, but that's not the kind of company that we're going to run here. And we hired a new leader for that role. We brought in a Coke person to lead that role. We felt it was really important, again, to kind of set that tone from the top, and it took a lot of our time, but we really wanted to invest in that company and in that location. It was critical for us in the economics of the deal because they had a very large manufacturing facility there. So we wanted to capitalize on that, but we weren't willing to do that if they weren't going to turn their culture around. So the headquarters at Coke told us very quickly, turn it around. If you can't, close it. I don't care about the economics. We have to have the right people and the right culture. Luckily, we were able to turn it around. It wasn't that the people were bad. They were following and doing what their leader told them to do. So we were able to turn around, but it did take a lot of intentionality and a lot of boots on the ground for that. All right, next is consistency. So here, I really feel like, hang on, I'm going to make sure I'm at the right spot here. Here we go, sorry, because I want to share the right stories with you guys. Leaders often make the mistake that assuming that everyone has to be treated the exact same, and when in fact it's consistency that they're looking for, not treating everyone exactly the same. So there's an expression that if all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. And that's trying to do the exact same approach on every single person exactly the same really misses the point. So I would like to point out that this last topic, consistency, establishes accountability and builds trust, which is very important in this topic. And so let's take a look at some behaviors of ethical leaders that support consistency. So they have consistent ethical behavior. Reputation is built on repetition. So it's important that leaders continuously give signals to show people that they can be trusting them. And again, I want to share an example here of when we didn't do a very good job of being consistent and it backfired. So for the HR people in the room, this was around flex work. So after COVID, We didn't know what the right answer was. Everyone's looking to me. I didn't know what the right answer was. I mean, we had never experienced a pandemic where employees didn't want to come back to work. And also at Williams, it was tough because we have a lot of essential workers who worked on the pipeline every single day, and they never had the luxury to call in or work from Teams or Zoom. They had to go to work anyways. And so we were in a real tough spot. And long story short, the senior leadership team was divided. Some of the leaders wanted to give 1 day work from home for eligible employees, and some leaders wanted to give 2 days flexibility to work from home. So what we ended up doing was making the easy decision that ended up being a hard decision, which was let every leader do what they want to do. So these exec leaders said, my people in my departments can work 1 day, and these exec leaders could have their departments work 2 days a week from home. And what that created was the haves and the have-nots. So not a good model. You had employees who worked in one department said, well, how do I get transferred to that department because I want 2 days versus 1 day? It also eroded some trust. You know, why can't you as senior leaders figure this out? Don't you get paid to figure this stuff out and you can't figure it out? So they felt like we took the easy way out, and they were kind of right. So what do you do? When you're in that point, what do? We reconvened and said, okay, this is not working. This is painful. The intent wasn't for it to be painful. The intent wasn't to be messy, but that's what we have. So let's be intellectually honest with ourselves and call a duck a duck. It's a mess. So how are we going to clean up the mess? So what we decided to do was, okay, the people who were working from home 2 days a week, that was working. There wasn't any significant production issues or productivity issues that we were aware of. So we said, okay, the market at this point, we had more market data. We were seeing other companies lean in that direction too. So we said, okay, the right decision is to go to 2 days. So in that case, we did not create consistency on the front end, but we added it on the back end. And we tried to be very clear with our employees and explain the why. We didn't get it right. Sorry it was painful. This is what we're going to do going forward. And if this isn't right, we'll repivot again, right? Things change all the time. So just being humble and honest about that, I felt like gained us a lot of ground with our employees just because we owned our mistake. And we said, look, we weren't consistent and we're going to provide consistency going forward. Another thing is that I want to point out is that case studies often show that ethical downfalls aren't the result of one decision. It's not like one decision crumbled and run, right? It's multiple decisions after another that lead to that. People don't go, okay, I'm going to be unethical today. I'm going to go off the diving board and jump into the deep end. No, they wade in from the shallow end and slowly get there. And so I think it's important to realize that that's why these daily decisions are so important, because if you're faced with a big one like that, that's going to be obvious. So it's the little smaller ones that can sneak up on you. So another thing that ethical leaders do is they don't tolerate deviations from the code. If it says this in the code of conduct, you're going to follow with it. We have a policy that says this, we're going to follow it. And employees notice that. And employees notice if a leader lets things slide, they're probably going to start letting things slide if they're a leader. So that's why it's so important that leaders lead by example in that way. Ethical leaders also show up and speak up for their teams. And that's something that I value with my team. They know I'm going to have their back. If I felt that what they did was right, the decision they made was right, I'm not just going to throw them under the bus and go, I don't know what that team was thinking, right? Like I own that. I clearly supported that as well, and so I have to speak up for my teams. So the next example I'll share with you is about a time when one of my favorite bosses, I felt like, demonstrated consistency and that he was looking out for the team and not just for himself. So this involved yet another transaction. We were very busy on M&A side of business, but it was, again, many years ago, so I'm not disclosing anything that I shouldn't, but we were looking at a deal, and for us, this was a pretty big deal. It was $750 million, 900 employees, and we were in the midst of about to close the deal, and what had happened, which I was not accustomed to because it had never happened before, is that we realized that there was an HR issue, and this was going to be a significant economic impact to our model for this company that we were thinking to buy. That had never happened before, and to be clear, has never happened since that time either in my entire career. Normally, it's not an HR issue. Normally, we can get over those hurdles. So what the issue was this particular company had 900 employees, and many of those employees, when we were doing due diligence, noticed that they were categorized as exempt, meaning that they were salaried employees or exempt from overtime. And when we first looked at it, at first blush, we're like, man, that sure seems like that would be an hourly role. But, let's dig into it. So we got job descriptions right. We did more due diligence. We tried to look at what was best practice in the industry. And my employment attorney at the time said, Debbie, I did some digging and it's bad. I said, what do you mean? He's like, there's 2 class action lawsuits that's been filed and they lost and they had to go back and pay back wages. So what you do in a case like this, you have to go back 2 years and do a look back analysis, which is pretty hard because typically you haven't tracked the time, so you have to guess what the time is, which typically you're going to overcompensate them for past 2 years, as well as looking forward, pay them for any overtime going forward. So this was going to be a big impact when you do this 2-year look back analysis, and by the way, they worked a ton of overtime, and then going forward. And so the CFO and I had talked about it, and the employment attorney talked about it, and we had a meeting coming up to talk about this deal. And my CFO at the time, he said, look, I really want you to not be your normal, transparent, passionate self about this concern. Could you, it's fine to express your concern, but, just could you taper it down a little bit? This is a really big deal. I think we're going to be profitable anyway. I think we can overcome this. The market's really good. I really want to get this deal done. If you could do that, that would be great. So that was a hard conversation. I didn't promise him anything. I slept on it, and I thought, I can't do that. Like, I have to be honest. I'm on this due diligence team for a reason. I found this. It's an issue. Not to say we couldn't get over it. We can absolutely go back 2 years, pay them overtime going forward. It's not that we can't, rectify this issue. It's just going to impact the economics of the deal. So I'm not saying kill the deal. I'm saying we're going to have to pay money, and it's going to cost us more than what we originally thought. So in the meeting, I said exactly that and said, look, I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but we're going to have some economic impacts to the project. So the CEO was very worried about that. He said, look, prices are good right now, but if the market takes a downturn, which I think it might happen, this is going to be a significant hit to this deal. So he said, I'm going to have to sleep on this. I don't know how I'm feeling about this. Well, the CFO tried to convince me and the CEO, like, look, I think it's going to be fine. We just need to do the deal. And the CEO really didn't back down and said, look, this is worrisome to me. I want to go home. I want to sleep on it, but I'm not feeling very good about it, if I'm being honest. Like, this has really put a damper on this deal for me. So the CFO then responds and says, look, we already have Coke board approval. We have to do the deal. We have approval. And my CEO said, no, we don't have to do the deal. Just because we have approval doesn't mean we have to do the deal. We have approval to do the deal if we still think it's a good deal, but we can do any deal we want. We want to do a good deal, and this may not be a good deal anymore. So long story short, after that conversation, we did not do the deal. My CEO said, look, I'm just worried about this. I'm nervous that the market's going to take a turn, and I don't want to do the deal. The CFO was very upset by that, and we ultimately asked the CFO to leave. The reason for that was my CEO said, look, I look to you as trusted advisors. I expect you to be honest with me. I expect us to have real and honest conversations about these things. It's not about us. If we took on a deal that was bad, we could be laying off people. This impacts people's lives. This isn't just a deal to me. This is people. And so he said, look, that day I lost a lot of confidence in him, and he said, I want to exit him from the organization. To be fair, there were other things as well, so it's not like it was just this one event that led to that decision, but this event certainly was the last straw for him. And so I say that to say there's a lot of good in that story, even though there's some bad in that story too. The good is that the CEO stuck to his gut, and even though had board approval, he said, I don't mind going back. I can explain why we're not going to do this. I'm not worried about saying, even though we got approval, that we're not going to do this deal. And then also that, again, he stood by his word and said, look, I'm not looking for someone to do things and they're not looking out for the good of the organization, and ended that person's employment. So again, just a really good leader, I think, to lead the way by example and lead tone at the top. So real quick, how can you apply this? So I've given a lot of stories, given a lot of things that I personally think are good traits for an ethical leader, but how do you apply this in your day-to-day? And I mentioned it's very imperative that you can recognize red flags. Again, can't give you a playbook for everything that happens, so it's important to recognize red flags, pause, and ask yourself these questions. And I really want to emphasize the pause. If you think about cybersecurity threats, why do so many people get sucked into them? Because there's a sense of urgency. Do this now. I need your help now. And we're good people. We want to do things. We feel obligated to help people, but sometimes that hurts us. And so it's always fine to pause before you make a decision. So ask yourself, is it ethical? Is it legal? Could it harm the company's reputation? Would I bet my job on it? Should I check with someone else for assistance? And it's absolutely okay to ask for help. how would it look if this went viral on the internet? Or how would it look if it was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal? Would I feel good about that, or would I feel sick to my stomach about that? And then how would this action or inaction appear to others? And the word inaction there is just as important as action, because people who sit on things and don't bring things up, they lack that courage that we talked about earlier. So these should just be a quick litmus test of things that you should or shouldn't do next if you're faced with these situations in your organization. And last but not least, I wanted to quickly, I went over a lot of examples and used some terminology, but these are just me. I didn't pull this off the internet. These are just things that I've learned over my 20 years of experience in HR. So in order to model the way, you really have to, again, create that tone at the top. I can't tell you enough how important that is, because then other people lead the way from that. You have to set clear and realistic expectations, and keyword there being realistic. If you expect perfection, you're not going to get it, and you're just kidding yourself if you demand that. We are humans. We are not going to be perfect, and we're going to fail, and we've got to get comfortable with that. And like I said, if you demand perfection, you're not getting it, and you're just lying to yourself. And that's not being intellectually honest with yourself, in my opinion. So that comes back to that consistency part. Also embrace a challenge culture and a learning culture, in a not a fear of failure culture. So this is that transparency. I've really felt like in my career, I didn't have a fear of failure. I could say, look, I messed this up, or I didn't know the answer to this, and I could always come back. I'm like, I don't know the answer, but I'll come back and get it for you. And that's okay to not know the answer sometimes. So transparency is important. Also recognizing those red flags and pausing, again, emphasis on the pause. And then have humility, and that's something sometimes I feel like if you have a fear of failure culture, you don't have that humility. Have humility, ask for help. No one is expecting us to be a SME, a subject matter expert in everything. So have humility, ask for help. And then also trust your gut. I can't tell you how many investigations I've done where employees said, I knew this wasn't right. I knew it in my gut, I knew it in my heart, I felt the pressure on my chest, but I did it. And so don't second guess your instinct, trust it. And then last but not least, reinforce the culture by daily actions and decisions, and that comes back to that accountability piece that I think is super important. So the path ahead. So after looking at this approach of accountability, transparency, and consistency, I really want to talk about what's next. So what do we do with all this information? Where do we go from here? So in my opinion, ethics and leadership go hand in hand, and ethical people and leaders are necessary drivers for our success. An ethical commitment from any leader is in any environment that will go a long way in creating and sustaining a healthy culture and work environment where everyone can be proud of. And ultimately, that's what I want to do. I want to be proud of the company I work for. I want to be proud of the leader I am, so I can go to sleep at night, even though I didn't sleep last night, but that's not why. And then respect produces accountability. Accountability feeds transparency and commitment drives consistency and results. So ethical leadership matters now more than ever, in my opinion. So let's challenge ourselves and each other to model the way. So with that, I wanted to leave some time for questions that you may have. Yes, Lynn?
So can you give any practical advice on how can you set yourself up to have people around you that will tell you when you might be taking that step off the path that you don't want to take?
Yep, so the question was, how do you practically set yourself up so you have people around you and surrounded by you that can help you when you get off the beaten path a little bit and you need to get back on the path? So I think that's where trusted advisors come in, and you have to trust your team and have that expectation of my team. And I tell my team, if I am up there saying something stupid, say, Debbie, that's really stupid. Like, that's not right. Don't say that. Tell me, tell me that this is not what I want you to do. Be open and honest, but it's really having that team of trust that you know that they're going to tell you if you're not doing something the way that they feel like needs to be done, or if you're wrong about something. So I think that's really key. But also not just with my team. I look at my team as also the other SVPs and the other VPs at Williams. We know each other, we have each other's backs, and they'll say, hey, I need to have a drink with you tonight. I need to talk to you about something. Can we go grab an appetizer downstairs? I really need to get something off my chest. And just having the ability to reach out and phone a friend and talk about it, I think that's also helpful too, and not be embarrassed of it. They know there's no judgment. Let's just talk about it. If you tell me something illegal, I have to take action, but unless that, I don't have to. If you need to just talk through a situation, we can do that. And so having the ability to call someone and have a trusted advisor that they know is going to be confidential and not share that with someone else, I think is really key and can really help people get back on the right path or prevent them from going on a path that they shouldn't be on. And again, those happen slowly. That's not normally a quick one-time thing. It's normally they slowly start to get off the path, and then before they realize it, they wake up and they're not on the path that they want to be on anymore. And then oftentimes they feel like it's too late. I've already gone down this path too far. It's too hard to turn back, or I don't have the humility to turn back. Ego gets in the way, and so they don't want to turn back sometimes. Good question. Other questions, comments? I hope I didn't tell too many stories. Yes, sir.
Have you found some tricks to balance that? We're all so busy right now, but we want to be available to hear those stories and that feedback from everyone, so we can make good ethical decisions. How do you balance the availability of, you need to hear from your organization, you need to hear from your peers, you also have your overwhelming amount of work to do, staying up till 3 in the morning.
Yes.
Have you found little tricks in order to balance that?
So the question was, is there a balance to finding that work-life balance of getting the amount of work that you have to get done while also being very available for your team or peers or colleagues to be able to call you if they need you? I wish I had found the answer to that. I don't. I typically always make time for people. I love people. I love what I do. I feel like they need me more than I need my slide on my PowerPoint to be perfect. And so I'm always going to pick people first. That's just me. And I just won't sleep to get my other work done. And just because I feel like people look to me for that role as well. And so I feel like I just can't let them down on that. And also I don't want to. Like I really love to help people. That's kind of why I'm in the role that I'm in. But I haven't found that balance, other than I will say sometimes I will, if people take a lot of my time, I shouldn't say this because it's being recorded, but I'll be like, hey, I have a 30-minute window and I have another meeting of someone right after it, so I have to. They're bookended. So it's like you got 30 minutes, so we've got to talk about the crucial things quickly to get through them because I have another meeting. I have someone coming into my office, at 3 o'clock. So I have used tactics to help because otherwise it'll be 2.5 hours later and I'm like, my kid is waiting on the sidewalk at aftercare. I've got to go get him. And so I have learned little tricks like that, especially for people who it's not like a big, it's just they want to catch up and they're very long-winded. And so sometimes I have to be mindful of my time because I'm like, otherwise I'm going to stay up till 2 a.m. because I've had a 2-hour conversation. So I've learned little tricks like that, but I still make time for them.
I love that. The default is people first.
Yeah, that's my default. That's just how I am. That's how I'm wired. I love people and I want to help them. And I hope I give good advice. I try to give sound advice and they know I'm going to be very real with them. But also part of that is I give people advice that sometimes they don't want to hear. I'm like, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Like, I think you messed this up. I think you had a misstep. I think you could have done this different. I think you should have handled this better. I think you overreacted. And that's sometimes hard for them to hear. But I'm like, look, I'm not judging. I'm just trying to help you. I want you to see it from someone else's point of view. Like, you're only looking at it from a myopic lens. And I want you to see how others around you may have seen that or how someone else may have perceived that. So sometimes that's hard. People don't like to hear that. But I tell them, this isn't going to be easy for you to hear, but I think you need to hear it. And I don't want you to defend yourself. I'm not looking for you to defend yourself. I just want you to go home and absorb it and then come back and we'll talk about it later. So but honestly, that's when people come back to me because they're like, I know you're going to shoot me straight. I know you're not going to sugarcoat it. So tell me, was I a complete jerk in that meeting? Yeah, you were. Like, maybe. Yes, Travis.
What kind of books are you reading to keep you energized?
So books. So I used to read a lot of books because I was on international flights and I love to have a book and read on the plane. Now I do audiobooks, which I don't like as much, but it's my only choice on my commute into work. So right now I've just started the book about Amazon working backwards. So I just started that, so I can't tell you if it's good or not because I'm early on in that. I've also been, kind of to your point, I've been reading several books. One is called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. One is called Indistractable, and I'm forgetting another one. But they talk about how we are a very connected world right now. So we have our cell phones, we have text messages, we have voicemails. I have Microsoft Teams, so there's a chat on Microsoft Teams. I have Outlook. I have my voicemail at work. So there's just a lot. I have LinkedIn. People contact me on LinkedIn. So there's a lot of different avenues that I'm getting bombarded. And so it's talking about how do we take out the noise and focus on the important. We're getting distracted by things that aren't making an impact and things that are not moving the needle. And we've got to, it's okay to be on social media. It's okay to do those things, but carve out your time. Be intentional, because otherwise you'll sit down on the couch and 4 hours later you've done nothing and you've still just been on Twitter or whatever. And so you're scrolling all the time. And so I really tried to be intentional about my time and my time with my boys and work-life balance. So one thing that I instituted was when I come home from work, I do not port in my laptop. So normally, my old self, I would come home, I would port my laptop up, have it open. The minute I heard the ding on Outlook, I would be running over there. Now I just leave it off. We have dinner together. I get them, get their showers and baths and get them in bed. And then I open up my laptop just to be intentional about my time with them. And it matters to them. It makes a difference. And it's like a 2.5 hour window. It's not, they're younger, so they go to bed pretty early. So it's just being intentional about that. So those are some of the books I've been reading lately about not being as distracted, because if you're not careful, you'll let that take up all your time, and then you're not focused on your goals and what you really want to work on. You're cluttered with stuff that didn't really fill your cup. And you want to stay focused on the things that fill your cup, that give you energy. Yeah. Yes, Mary?
What about podcasts?
Yeah, so podcast. I also listen to podcasts. I was telling them on the way here, because my schedule is so busy, I don't always get to attend all the OK Ethics. And so what I've been doing is listening to them in my car. So I just go to the website before I leave work, get it keyed up, and then on my drive home, I just listen. So I don't get to see the speaker, but I get to hear them. And that's been a really good thing. But I love Brene Brown. There's a lot of different podcasts. It's kind of different. I listen to The Dispatch when I'm trying to get some political viewpoints, because they try to be very neutral. So I try to, get various avenues, because I'm not on social media very much. And so I really try to listen to podcasts when I can in my car on the way to work, on my commute, or in the shower. I know it's sad, but it's true. The echo is pretty good. You can actually hear it pretty good. All right, other questions? I know we're getting close to time. No? All right. Well, sounds good. Well, thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate it.